Hello and welcome to another Codebreaker presentation. This is a special occasion, 30 years since the IRS pissed me off. This is take 2 of this presentation. I went at take 1 with the attitude that, why let a perfectly good bartending career go to waste? And I popped the cork on a few public servants responsible for the government's reply in the case, captioned right here. This man versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, his docket number and everything right there on the 7th Circuit. The exchange of briefs was just completed. He filed this opening brief, the government filed its reply, and he filed his rebuttal to that reply. And in the first take, very cloudy rhetoric, dark, sometimes profane. I thought, we could take a positive from this. And I'm positive that the quote-unquote attorneys who wrote the government's reply on appeal, they shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a grade school or a middle school or a high school. They're a threat to everybody around them. This is the type of person that sends innocent people to prison. Here you have a man who's clubbed the government attorneys like salmon in a bathtub. And all they can do is run from the law and try to take him for tens of thousands of dollars. That's a child molester. But the positives? 30 years, same arguments. Well, actually, 30 years I began my research. 25 years they received these arguments administratively at the IRS. By the beginning of 94, after a year of futility administratively, a bunch of people opted to take the arguments to tax court. I wrote the first briefs in my life. December of 93 and the first quarter of 94. And by the October term of 1998, 5 of my clients had petitioned the Supreme Court. I wrote all of their paperwork, teaching myself on the way up as I went in the first briefings of my life. My first appeal, I got 8 new issues admitted on appeal by proving tax court policy of penalizing people was a miscarriage of justice. So I had a clue. For starters, I don't know where it came from, but I was made to analyze tax law. By the time I finally got to analyzing it, I had already performed in certain occupations that demand an incredible memory. And so I've been taking it to them with Section 83. Let's start with the easiest. It's 1 paragraph of tax law, and it's a secret. So what you have here, here's the big positive. The big positive. We can take a step forward in our understanding and approach. We can take a step forward. 30 years. April of 1988. April 15th. Knock on my door. IRS agent Marty Webb. You didn't claim taxes in 1984. Yeah, I know it. Got a business card. Scheduled a hearing 3 weeks out, canceled, rescheduled, canceled, rescheduled, canceled, rescheduled, moved away, changed jobs, and started studying tax law. I'd never even heard the word statute. And first place I went, the index of the tax code, when I found a library that had a found the tax code in the, let's see, what library would that have been? Probably Linwood, Washington. And I went to the index of the tax code, requirement to report tips, because Marty Webb had told me, your tips are 61A gross income. And I remembered what she said. I remember what everybody says. I was an extremely gifted, high-volume bartender. You remember everything. And she says there's 61A tips. And so I went to the tax code index, and it says requirement to report tips, section 6053. And I go to section 6053, and you got to it says you got to report these tips, those tips, these tips, and it didn't mention 61A tips. So the first place I went, I found a lie, and that got me going. So here I am 30 years later. I guess you could call me a quitter. Yeah. A lot of that 30 years has been tough. The first 5.5 years was research. I emerged with a treatise in '94 called Codebreaker, a curriculum really, a lot of writings, essays, not just a briefing of these differences between the IRS and the tax code. And here we threw it against the wall in U.S. tax court in Indiana. He appealed, having reserved for appeal the issues tax court will impose penalties for. Hey, the law says any money or property that I paid for my paycheck is gross income. The term any is all-inclusive. I have all these Supreme Court cases that the government won saying any is all-inclusive. Where's the law that allows you to exclude labor from this definition of cost? They'll penalize you for asking. So it's an illegal argument. So he reserved it for appeal along with a couple of others. For which he would have been penalized. The government agrees. And so they're illegal in tax court. And then the government proposes you can't raise them now. You didn't raise them in tax court. They're illegal. You have to incur a bunch of penalties in tax court to get the right to appeal. This arises from the ability to prove with statute that they're incorrect. It's the paradigm shift I've been waiting for everybody to discover. My treatise was complete in 1994, early. And nobody bothers to do it. Changes what's always been a statutory case. They throw section 61A at you and say all compensation. Well, 61A begins by saying except as otherwise provided. That means if you find an exception, you have to honor it. And you'll see proof here that the law is last. Thus, my disclaimer. Nothing you'll hear me say is intended as legal advice. Anything that sounds like that to you, just consider it something somebody else might do on a planet far, far away where the law matters. It doesn't matter here. I prove it on a daily basis. Believe it. Every judge is as corrupt as the day is long. Here is the big positive, the step forward. When you see the government's reply to the briefed issues, and I'll proceed with the understanding and presumption that you have taken the 2.5-hour Section 83A tutorial here on my YouTube channel. That you have taken the tutorial called Key to the Code. There's a couple of my earliest videos uploaded here on this channel, because I cruise with those two arguments and club the government with the obvious truth, and they won't come to the table to debate me. So the big truth, the step forward, the government in its briefing will prove to you that it views the court as the place to commit the crime of extortion and racketeering. They're looking at the court as a place to come to pull the wool over everybody, when in fact they don't have the law on their side. They don't. The briefing proves it. They can't even mention key provisions. What are you doing in court? You call yourself an attorney? And you can't even mention my key provisions, and you ask the court to agree that I'm a tax protester? That's why I couldn't hold my tongue in the first approach, the first take, because that truth is all I've seen in the 25 years that I've been an advocate, with tax issues popping up from time to time, big time in the 90s, and several times since 2006. When I filed a criminal complaint with 80 members of Congress over these findings, saying, you must be stealing, nobody can deny a word of it, and it's true today. 2018. So for my 30th anniversary, I give you this paradigm shift in understanding is that the government, the Department of Justice, views the court as a party or a proposed party to the scheme, but as an entity that they can count on to accomplish screwing this guy for tens of thousands of dollars when he's just clubbed the government. So from this, you'll understand, yeah, the law is perfect. This is exactly how it operates. Citizens of the U.S. are only named in a regulation, and all property is a cost. Just those two arguments, they can't overcome them. And so about the Department of Justice, you know, this is what they do. And they view the court as the entity that will help them. This man will lose on appeal. April 15th was a Sunday. He filed this April 13th. Friday the 13th, April 2018. And he's going to lose. But for what it's worth, the exchange of briefs is complete. And the government threw a bunch of crap on a piece of paper, called it a memorandum, and filed it in a court one level below the Supreme Court. And they don't even mention the controlling provisions on how you and I are supposed to figure our cost when we sell our services for compensation. And here's your proof. 30 years after the IRS came to my door, 24 and a half years after I completed my treatise, and this is what it still does to the government. They can't even talk to you about controlling provisions. All they reference is 61A, which begins with, except as otherwise provided. And 61B says, for items specifically included in gross income, see Part 2 of the chapter. That's Section 71 through 90. Section 83 is in there, right? And you got the IRS Chief Counsel saying Section 83 provides for what is to be included in gross income. Well, how come I can't talk about this statute? Because of 61A, Your Honor. And they won't. Section 83A explains how to tax the entire workforce. So this 30th anniversary show is about the court. He's going to lose. The government is right. The court is where to go. But what you'll see in this case when he loses is that the judge has come out in public to fondle its corruption. I've changed what is always a statutory argument. He owes taxes on that, Your Honor. 61A says all compensation. And when you know how to argue the law and they can't talk about the law, the controlling provisions, it makes it a constitutional case. It turns what's always been a statutory argument into a constitutional debate on, does he meet the standard, the void for vagueness doctrine? You have to be taxed by clear language. The government has to put its finger on the law permitting the taxman to put its finger on the citizen. Blocks of Supreme Court cases reiterating these sentiments. How, when you have to keep the law a secret, has he not eclipsed that requirement that he wins if you can't prove he owes? Well, we can't, and he'll lose. And so the DOJ is right. Every judge is as corrupt as the day is long, because this man is going to lose. Now, one dynamic of his arguments. I've never had anyone come to me with a Chapter 2 Social Security self-employment tax controversy. So what I did in this instance, he has one, I isolated Social Security, just one issue, as a tax inapplicable to citizens of the United States. Because of the definitions, because of statutory language, I found a bunch of evidence that Social Security does not apply to citizens of the United States. And I brief it that way. Strictly about Social Security. Then I go to Chapter 1 and say citizens of the U.S. are only named in a regulation. Then I go to Section 83 saying all property is a cost. Then there's the argument that it isn't clear language if you can't discuss these provisions. And the last issue is I can't have review in tax court. The controversy is over $50,000, and under newly enacted, I think it went into effect last summer, Tax Code Section 7345 says they can suspend your passport if you're not on a payment plan. So, and there's a lien and levy in place. So, and they argue against that, saying, you know, he can, the IRS commissioner has to certify that and notify you, and then you can challenge it in tax court whether or not they'll suspend your passport. Didn't you just agree with me that these arguments are illegal in tax court? I can't get review in tax court. I've proven it. They admitted it. Yeah, they'll penalize you for these arguments. So America has no courts. The taxman owns every single judge. You don't have a country. A country has courts. You have an open sewer surrounded by razor wire. You're the personal possessions of a hate group you call government. And these people's children go to the same school as your children. They might even infiltrate your church. They have no business walking among normal people. They're kidnappers and robbers. I've been saying your relationship with government is the same relationship you have with somebody that would run up to your car with a crowbar and steal it at a traffic light from you. It's different. This is the Rodney King beating on paper. And first, the DOJ with its reply brief, that's the cop with the club. And what's wrong with this picture? Well, you have 12 officers on scene. And 11 of them leave Stacy Kuhn, that one officer, to the task of getting Rodney King onto his stomach. You're trying to tell me at this point, and at this point, and at this point, on and on, 12 officers are not able to get one man onto his stomach, and so one man must club him senseless. The exchange of briefing is complete. The club is now passed from the Department of Justice to the judges on appeal, a 3-judge panel. And they will team up to club this man out of tens of thousands of dollars when he in fact has proven with the law and with standards of due process. If the government can't prove you owe it, you win. He's done it the hard way with law, and he's going to lose when the government's brief is toilet paper on its best day. Happy 30th anniversary. Here's proof America has no courts. Opening brief, table of contents, table of authorities. You know, writing a document like this is kind of intense. And it's, you got his docket number. If you want a copy of this document, you can go to Pacer and get it. But anyway, it's this is the draft I sent to the client for proofing and to fill in a few blanks that I turned into a PDF. Exhibits on appeal. Notice a deficiency that allows him to petition tax court for 2012 and 2013. And the government's U.S. tax court, or the taxpayers' U.S. tax court petition in tax court without its exhibits. Exhibit C, the government's tax court reply to the petition and U.S. tax court's final order. And then Exhibit E was 1993 through 2016 IRS publication saying that your cost are your services or other property. I'm not kidding. 23 years. Your cost is your services. Okay, thank you. And you get to court, no. That's frivolous. We're penalizing you thousands of dollars. It's that bad. And they didn't mention that in their reply brief. Statement of the case, you don't have to read this. I really want to get to the arguments. Here's the appellate brief. This is, okay, I want to introduce the case. How would I introduce the case? I think that speaks volumes. Let's take a second to read this. Oh, man. These people are so vile. United States Tax Court will penalize all who seek to apply governing provisions to their compensation for personal services or who make a statutory claim that seeks to change or constrain the appellee in any way. The ruling below very plainly defines the term tax protester as anyone who argues statute against the IRS. Yeah. Despite the confrontational tone of appellant's petition, in his petition, he was insolent toward the court about the policy of penalizing people for arguing statute. Tax court did not step forward to deny that the law is off limits under threat of enormous monetary sanctions, but it crumbles under the weight of just this. How did those provisions on that website that you call the tax protester website operate in your conclusion that 1.1-1 does not deviate from Section 1? That's the regulation that identifies the citizen of the United States as the subject, where Section 1 does not. How does Section 83 operate in your conclusion that an American owes an income tax on his or her paycheck? Tax court refuses to speak of these controlling provisions and others, and will handily bury all litigants who dare to do so. A fortiori, or therefore, a tax protester is anyone who uses the law to challenge the IRS. This is his petition. Here I am. I'm in tax court, or I'm on appeals, and this is who I am, and this is what I'm here to talk about and throw around. In this case, tax court did nothing to change the course on this policy of penalizing statutory arguments. And here are those folks from the 1990s seeking answers to these questions. So this goes back a long way, and watch how poorly the government responds to these challenges. Here's tax court. One year, oh, they didn't bring us any issues at law, and so we're going to penalize them. The next year, all they did was bring us issues at law, so we're going to penalize them. It's something else. Okay, here's the briefing. Social Security does not apply to me. This is the definition in Chapter 2, Social Security Self-Employment. An individual who is not a citizen of the United States breaks on. That's not me. Okay. And this is not me. Let's see. At the end here, an individual who is not a citizen of the United States shall not be considered a non-resident alien, meaning he will be considered a resident citizen. That's not me. Chapter 21, FICA, Social Security Employee, Federal Insurance Contributions Act. An individual who is a citizen of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, but not otherwise a citizen of the U.S., breaks on. It's not me. That's the law. Well, they didn't mention... Okay. They mentioned this one, but for a different part of this statute. This is not the whole statute. It's a definition that contains other stuff. But they did not address the definition of citizen in Social Security. And look at this. It's not me. They didn't speak of these provisions. Look, here's a statute that says, for tax in the possessions, see Chapters 2 and 21. We just did that. Here's the definition of citizen in Social Security benefits, Title 42. Section 411B2, an individual who is not a citizen of the United States shall not be considered a non-resident alien, meaning he shall be considered a citizen. It says the same thing in Section 211 of the original 1935 Social Security Act. 879A2, a Chapter 1 provision where they say citizens of the U.S. are, and it says if you have a non-resident alien spouse with trade or business income, go to Chapter 2. You can't be Chapter 1 citizen and Chapter 2 citizen. You can't do it. An individual who is not a citizen of the United States, and Chapter 1 is a citizen who is. And if you have a non-resident alien to Chapter 1 citizenship with trade or business income, send them to Chapter 2. You can't be both citizens. Here's a statute, that's Congress, that says Section 3811 is equal to Chapter 2 and 21. And you go to Section 3811 of the 1939 Tax Code, collection of taxes in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. It's not citizens of the U.S. You cannot be both citizens. They didn't mention any of these provisions in their briefing. This is the Supreme Court. Thus, Congress did not reach every transaction in which an investor actually relies on inside information. A person avoids liability if he does not meet the statutory definition of insider. That's metropolitan. However severe the consequences, we got to stick to statutory language. That's Jay versus Boyd. And so I make the argument, in the tax code, Congress has indeed named a subject of the tax in 2 and 21, or Chapter 2, that's the subject of the chapter, or of the briefing, and has chosen to exclude the citizenship. Appellee says that the appellant enjoys, in bracket, meaning I don't enjoy any of this that you're forcing me through here, all portions of the alleged deficiency purportedly imposed under 1401, Chapter 2, Social Security Self-Employed, should therefore be invalidated. Okay, and now I'm in Chapter 1 only, where only regulation identifies my citizenship. And I point out, saliently, nowhere in Section 1 is there any reference whatsoever to any citizenship as is found in other chapters of the Internal Revenue Code and relevant statutes elsewhere, such as at Chapter 2, that's not me. Chapter 21, that's not me. Matching FICA from the employer. Same citizenship as defined in 3121E. These aren't me. Section 211 of the Social Security Act. Let's see. Such as at these statutes. In those statutes, Congress thought it necessary to expressly exclude by reference citizens of the United States. Congress is acutely aware of such citizen and chose not to identify him as the subject of any 26 U.S.C. income tax. They should have never even spoken to an American about the tax code. And here's the regulation they wrote to get around the fact that Section 1 doesn't mention who's subject. They wrote this. And this issue is briefed on appeal in the Seventh Circuit, which has already said this. He claimed that he was neither a citizen nor a resident of the United States as those terms are used in the 14th Amendment or in 26 CFR 1.1-1, the regulation identifying those persons who are subject. So the court even looks at Section 1 and the regulation and says the regulation identifies the subject. And we're in that same court. Chew on that, Your Honor. That'll be a good appealable issue if they won't even address this. I'm asking in this briefing, are you overturning this case? That's a good question. See how inconveniently this becomes, how very quickly it becomes inconvenient. This is bad news. This is 25 years after they got the argument. Rossello versus United States, 1983, where Congress includes particular language in one section of a statute but omits it in another section of the same act, it is generally presumed that Congress acts intentionally and purposely in the disparate inclusion or exclusion. Oh no! What are they going to do with that? That's the Supreme Court, and not in antiquity. Nowhere has Congress supplied a statutory definition of the term citizen which identifies the appellant as the subject of the Section 1 income tax, so the appellee, the government, wrote and promulgated 1.1-1 to do so. That is impermissible as a violation of the 16th Amendment that says Congress has the authority to impose the taxes. And here's the case law that says regulations can't deviate from statute. You can pause that if you want to read it. Take the other tutorials here on my YouTube channel, and I've already clubbed them into submission if the law mattered. We know they can't overcome these arguments. I've already been in a bunch of other venues with them, and they're different answers than they gave this time. They're closer to the argument in their diatribe and rebuttal in this case than they've been, but they still don't get to the point. But I've sealed off this avenue, that avenue, all the different ways of escape they formulated in the past to show that they're bogus. And so I boxed them in, and now they have to get closer to the argument. They did. They still don't get to the brass tacks of whether or not the law has operated. They can't mention a bunch of these provisions. I'm only named in a regulation. Now we come to issue C. All property is a cost. Appellant has been deprived of the provisions of 26 U.S.C. 83, 212, 1001, and 12. There's nothing unequivocal about that. In doing so, the appellee is in violation of the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, because it's not Congress that says I owe a tax. It's the executive branch that says, let's just put the law aside. Labor's not a cost. That's the executive branch imposing a tax. While it is universally held that 83, not 61A, explains how to tax all compensation, tax court and other courts have imposed severe sanctions on anyone who dares to seek review of its language and that of its implementing regulations in relation to standard compensation such as fees, commissions, tips, salaries, wages, self-employment earnings, and the like, what the government now classifies as non-employee compensation. That just simply allows them to lump Chapter 2 and Chapter 1 together. Self-employment earnings is a word from Chapter 2. Compensation for services, fees, commissions, and is self-employment earnings called something else. So when they say self-employment earnings, you stop and you ask, are they talking about Chapter 2 or talking about Chapters 1 and 2? So here's 61B for items specifically included in gross income, because they start in 61A. It says except as otherwise provided. And it then instructs me that I should go to 71 and following. And the IRS Office of Chief Counsel says Section 83 provides for the determination of the amount to be included in gross income when property is transferred to an employee or independent contractor in connection with the performance of services. So there, we're going to Section 83, not 61A. They didn't mention 61B or this in their reply brief. And the case law that Section 83 applies to all compensation. Pause it if you need to. Take the Section 83 tutorial. These are in there. Here we go. And here's the 7th Circuit concurring with a couple of cases above. That's inconvenient. And current 2011, Goodmanson, Section 83, which governs the taxation of property transferred in connection with the performance of services. Here's the standard from 1996, Talmadge. They say you didn't buy, since he paid nothing for his labor, his cost is zero. The law says any money or property is a cost. Well, not today. Who says so? The executive branch. You can't do that. The law says it's a cost. They took an item that's cost and made it profit with a mandate that did not come from Congress. The worker's cost for his services, he didn't buy his labor before he sold it. The worker's cost for his services is zero, not their fair market value. And this court, Talmadge, in 1996, 1995, they received the petition like November. And he stood in open court and said, I'll waive all facts of the case today if they'll just tell me how to comply with Section 83. He was penalized $6,500 for that. And then the 4th Circuit said, yep, based on tax court, we affirm. 1996, Then, in this case, in November of 2016, I think it was, this is a quote of his petition in tax court. He cited the Talmadge decision and then quoted it in his petition in tax court. End of the quote of his petition. And now we find in the government's response to that in tax court, they said, we agree with the court as stated in the opinion of the court cited by the petitioner. Why didn't they mention Talmadge? They just said, we agree with the case that he cited. Because they don't want Talmadge cited in another decision. Professionals would say, yes, the standard articulated in Talmadge, tax court docket number 339-95 is the official standard, or that's our official stance. No, it's it's the case cited by the petitioner. Don't say Talmadge. Isn't that easy? It's so easy to be a racketeer because the judges are worse. Man. So 2016, the standard is the Talmadge decision. You didn't pay for your labor, so everything's a profit. Well, let's see what the law says. Here's Section 83. The excess of the value of your paycheck over the amount paid, if any, shall be included in gross income. Take the tutorial. I'm not going to stop and divulge a bunch of research to support my interpretation of that. The excess, the value of your paycheck over, or your fees, tips, commissions, whatever it was for services, over the amount paid. To include in gross income the excess, we have to determine what the amount paid is. That reveals what the excess is. Is it cost or is it profit? Is it cost or is it income? Income isn't defined in the code. Wrong. Cost defines income. This is the definition of cost. The amount, if any, paid for such property over the value, over the excess, over the value of the property paid for it, shall be included in gross income. And so the court is supposed to say, we shall begin our analysis with an exegesis or an interpretation of the general provisions of Section 83. We shall then examine those provisions in conjunction with the facts. No, they don't. Never will they do that. Ever. This is a 1988 case, the year I opened the tax code and began studying law. And this is how they did it in 1988. We'll get into the statute. Let's look at the language. Compare it to the facts. Can't have that now. Why is that? Because here it comes. The amount paid refers to the value of any money or property paid. And it does not go on to say, oh, unless it's property within which you have no cost, like your labor. It never says that. It says value of any money or property paid. The value of my labor is what I get from an unrelated party who buys it. So the amount paid is the value of my labor. Only excess over the value of my labor goes to gross income. 1.83-4B2 says if the property to which 1.83-1 applies, that's everything, is transferred at an arm's length, the basis of the property, the cost of the paycheck, in my hands shall be determined under Section 1012. 1012 says the cost is the amount paid for such property in cash or other property. And it doesn't exclude labor or other property that you didn't buy before you sold it. It's all inclusive. 1011 says that standard is also known as the adjusted basis. That's all it does. It assigns a synonym. 1001, computation of gain or loss, tells you what to do with those amounts. From the amount realized upon the sale or exchange of property, there shall be withdrawn a sum sufficient to restore the adjusted basis prescribed by Section 1011 and the regulations thereunder. The amount which remains after the adjusted basis has been restored to the taxpayer constitutes the realized gain. If that isn't the definition of income, you need to go back to the Patriot movement. You're lost. Because there it is right there. It's the excess over the amount paid. And this is the provision that they don't even mention. They concede this applies. Yeah, they can't even talk. They didn't even mention. They cited this once and didn't quote it, didn't get into the language of it, and the amount paid in any money or property. They didn't mention this one, this one, this one, or this one to say that they don't apply. They didn't mention them to say we misinterpreted. They didn't even mention them. And here's Monsanto, Supreme Court, the government won, 1989. Any means all of it. You can pause that if you want to read that. It's in the 83 tutorial. And here are the 5 cases that the government has won in the Supreme Court, saying the term any is all-inclusive. It includes everything unless you can identify a law that says you can exclude something. They can't identify a law. Appellant insists upon this standard. You bet he does. And he can't have it. He will lose. We have clubbed the government to death with this argument on paper, but the only paper that counts is theirs because the law doesn't count. You can fold this into paper airplanes. Their pleadings are billy clubs, and this is the Rodney King beating. The interpretation of any is universal. Look at all these appellate cases that say, yep, we agree with the Supreme Court. Any means all of it. And this is from the decision, 2008, the most recent win on any property by the government in the Supreme Court. Let's see. The word any means all of it. You can read that by pausing. And here is the government's reply brief in that case, where the government is telling the Supreme Court the term any means all of it. The word any has an expansive meaning, that is, one or some indiscriminately of whatever kind, except labor, Your Honor. This is the Treasury speaking. We can alter the law by picking and choosing when we see the term any, but everybody else has to read the term any as all-inclusive, but not us. We can call the shots. This is the government's brief from 2008, and today you get the opposite, and they won't even talk about the controlling provisions. ID, that means the same thing. It's from the government's brief. Any property, broad, unambiguous. Okay, I want that standard. Well, you can't have it. This is a tax case. So I argue that it's arbitrary and therefore impermissible. We can't talk. They didn't even mention those controlling provisions. It's something else. So these are the quotes from publication 17. And we can cruise right from here to the void for vagueness argument. Here it is. I should win. The tax isn't imposed by clear language. The government goes on and on about how, well, you received compensation. Well, it's not compensation that triggers the requirement to file a return and to keep records. 6012 says anybody having gross income that equals or exceeds the exemption amount has to file a return and keep records. How did Section 83 operate in your conclusion? I owe an income tax. I had gross income. How did it operate? They can't. If appellant, the taxpayer, if appellant needn't file a return, he needn't keep records. If appellant has received only 83's amount paid, he has no gross income or excess, no duty to file a return, therefore no duty to keep records. Appellant sees regulations and the appellee's tax guide for individuals instructing just the opposite of the Talmadge exclusion of personal services from cost, which has been proven to be an arbitrary exclusion which is impermissible. After using the term any in Section 83A, any money or property in 1.83-3G, and outright telling the appellant that his cost includes his services, appellee now asks of this court that it ratify the Talmadge exclusion as lawful despite the non-existence of authorities that provide, except for property within which one has no basis. This is a trap, meaning entrapment. They tell you all this, and I see the regulations. Any property is a cost. I got all these cases in favor of my interpretation. You go to court, well, none of that counts, and we're going to penalize you. We have stomped the IRS into the dust with this briefing. And look at how densely packed it is. Supreme Court cases. Relying on an expert opinion, you should not be held liable, for penalties anyway. Pause if you want to read it. Pause if you want to read it. Because I want to get to the government's toilet paper, if you can believe that. The tax at issue is not imposed by clear language. The Supreme Court has said over and over again it has to be. No, not today. This guy's going to lose. Do you understand? He's going to lose. This is a great quote from Tax Court, Hartman versus Commissioner. But the Internal Revenue Code cannot be so read, for each section is not a self-contained whole, but rather a building block of a complex interrelated statute. They look at 61A and say, all compensation, line number 1, Your Honor, but it begins by saying, except as otherwise provided. And then 61B says, go to Part 2 of the chapter, where Section 83 is, for items specifically included in gross income. Those statutes, they're stuck on 61A because it's the burden of proof statute. It puts the burden on me. Can you prove, except as otherwise provided? Everyone else has to say no. I'm the one that can say, yeah, I got claims. I did more work. I have a better understanding of all this than anybody before I wrote the Codebreaker curriculum. This is, you can hear that I'm simply clubbing them with the law. And in their reply brief, they can't even talk about the provisions that are key. And yet, he's going to lose. And the positive from this, we now can readily and freely say, America has no courts. The government believes that. When you read the memorandum, who am I to say no? Well, it's going to be proven as soon as he loses. None of this counts. You could end up in prison. Tax evasion. Lanzetta is one of a well-recognized group of cases insisting that the law give fair notice of the offending conduct. Well, only gross income is only the excess over the amount paid, and for the life of me, I can't get the value of my labor out of Section 83 into 61A. Can you help me or what? Yeah, here's a penalty for $5,000. Good luck on appeal. Where is this standard when that's the policy? All this great case law about due process right goes right out the door for the tax man. The tax man owns the courts. This is from 2001 Supreme Court, quoting a state case, Supreme Court case. When the tax gatherer puts his finger on the citizen, he must also put his finger on the law permitting it. That's good enough for me. Can we have that? No. Now that you know which provisions of the tax code to argue and exactly how to argue them. This is old stuff for me. It's been in my brain for over 25 years. And so when I brief it, it's a matter of take no prisoners. I'm going to club you like a baby seal and call animal control to scrape up your flaming carcass with a snow shovel. Leave this man alone. That's my job as an advocate, is to leave the government in Siberia with all of its notions. And I've done it. The judge is the escape route, and the judge is up to it. And we remember what they're supposed to do. We'll begin our analysis with an interpretation of general provisions, Section 83, and then compare it with the facts. Why can't I have that? Well, it's because here's your penalty, $5,000, good luck on appeal. And you don't get to the bottom. Here's the one that says, with this obvious void in access to the law, you're going to suspend my passport privileges? That's unconstitutional. I have rights to procedural due process. because they pulled that passport suspension stuff on people in the 50s, maybe the 60s. You're a communist, and revoked passports because the people made it onto a list of communists. Sound familiar, folks? Didn't we just have 8 years of that crap, and it's lingering through this administration? So anyway, the right to be heard before being condemned to suffer grievous loss of any kind, even though it may not involve the stigma and hardships of criminal conviction, is a principle basic to our society. Horse pucky. This is McGrath, 1951. And, you know, we've been here. You can't have tax law, and we're going to take your passport. You're a tax protester. Okay, and you can't even talk about the law, and I'm supposed to lose passport privileges? Listen, can you think of any public servant that would dare abuse that authority? I can't think of one that wouldn't. Due process requires that a hearing be a real one, not a sham or a pretense, according to the court we're in, the Seventh Circuit. Well, you're right in the middle of a sham proceeding right here, because those provisions in Social Security and the Section 83 equation, they can't even talk about them. They didn't even mention them. Kent versus Dulles. Man, authority to withhold passports to citizens because of their beliefs or associations. Don't do that. There's a quote from that case. It's one of my favorites. Outside areas of plainly harmful conduct, every American is left to go where he pleases, do what he pleases, shape his life as he sees fit. Something like that. Those were the days. Yeah. Not to be taken away without due process. And I make that argument, and you'll see how terribly they respond to that, just saying, he can go to tax court because they can't suspend the passport until he goes to tax court. He can challenge it. You just agreed it's illegal in tax court to make these challenges. Can you hear the desperation in that situation? How that would drive an opposing attorney to fits? Pardon me. But the attorney is up to it, and you're going to learn that individual's name. And in my spare time, I'm going to write nasty limericks about its knuckle-dragging children. The law the law plainly permits. This is important. Supreme Court cases, and look at this: Seventh Circuit, Seventh Circuit, Seventh Circuit, Seventh Circuit, Seventh Circuit. So I'm hitting a home run with this one. To punish a person for doing what the law plainly permits is a due process violation of the most basic sort. That comes from Bordenkircher versus Hayes. And Accord, meaning on the same topic, citing Bordenkircher, these cases. Run from that. The law plainly permits the appellant to treat the amount paid as not gross income, to treat any money or property paid as not gross income, and to treat cash or other property as not gross income, as cost. And cited the statutes he says he's been deprived of. This isn't clear enough for a criminally insane judge. I mean, a judge. That's the oxymoronic of the day. The oxymoronical. If this void of access to the law is allowed to persist, appellants' rights to travel outside America will be suspended until such time as an agreement for payment is made with the appellee and cash is flowing to pay what nobody can prove is owed by law. And he's going to lose. Okay. We threw it all against the wall to see what sticks. And here's his appendices. One appendix, with 5 exhibits, and I culled the exhibits except publication 17 from this PDF document and left this in because it's a hoot. 1.83-3G, the value of any money or property paid. Publication 17, Part 14, 1993 edition. The basis of property you buy is usually its cost. The cost is the amount of cash and debt obligations you pay for it, and the fair market value of other property or services you provide in the transaction. Your cost also includes cost is the fair market value of other property or services you provide. And when you get to tax court, it's the opposite. And we're going to penalize you thousands of dollars. You believe that, tripe? We got another one here. And they go on. It says the same thing in the next year. And I started using it as an exhibit in tax cases. And so they rewrote that paragraph. Part 14, here it is, different paragraph. The cost is the amount you pay in cash, debt obligations, or in other property. Well, now it sounds like Section 1012. Cash or other property, right? It's the one that you're supposed to use to figure your cost. 1.83-4B2 says apply Section 1012. I do that. It says cash or other property. So does Publication 17. From bad to worse. Same paragraph. Now let's go way forward because it gets fruitful. Okay. The basis of property you buy, and it's part 13 of the publication now. It's been edited. The basis of property you buy is usually its cost. The cost is the amount you pay in cash, debt obligations, other property, or services. And they say this year after year after year from like, I don't know, 2010 on, maybe earlier. Which one was this? This is 2012. Several years in a row. Yeah, your cost is your services. Oh, okay, I really want that. We're in tax court. Now you go to appeal. Lucky you didn't penalize you. Well, I didn't raise the issue in tax court. I reserved it because you'll penalize me. Here we are on appeal, and he's going to lose, even though the government has said the opposite for 23 years. And here, drum roll please, are the names of the users of the toilet paper we're about to view. The ones who clearly shouldn't be allowed to communicate or travel into close proximity with a child or to a child. Richard E. Zuckerman, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Andrew M. Weiner. Julie Camporcero, I'm guessing, Avetta, attorneys at the Tax Division at the DOJ in Washington, D.C., handling a 7th Circuit case. We have our table of contents. Nature of dispute. Oh, sure. Don't hear it from them, Your Honor. They don't know how to even... Taxpayer claims this and that. When you hear it from them in this document, you're going to say, that's not what he claimed at all. They say, taxpayer does not, and indeed cannot deny, he is subject to the Chapter 2 Social Security tax. Excuse me, he does in spades, an entire briefed issue, the first one in the memorandum. It's the distance they run from the law that tells you this court is where the government believes it should go to run from the law. And he's going to lose. And that's confirmation that every court in America is where you go to run from the law if you're the government with panties on fire in an extortion scheme. That's the positive. I'm positive of those. It's a positive step forward. We know the character of the beast. We're very well acquainted with it, and it's fresh. He's going to lose. This exchange of briefing was finished on Friday, April 13th. Brief of the issues. Oh, I'm way past that. Excuse me. Reply by the DOJ. Okay. We got past the tape. Oh, excuse me. And, oh boy, table of authorities. This is telling. What did they not mention? Here are all the provisions we mentioned in our brief, Your Honor. Okay, Section 1. Section 2, no idea why they do that. 61, but they don't mention 61B. 63, taxable income, that's gross income minus deductions. Section 83, they throw stones at it, but they won't get into the language of it. And you don't see Section 212, 1001, 11, and 12 when they list in numerical order the provisions that they cite in their memorandum. We know Section 1012 governs cost, and they didn't even mention it. They don't mention Section 3121E, definition of citizen, in FICA. They don't get into the definition of citizen in this statute. They cite it for another reason. And so we still don't have a discussion of how to determine gross income. And now we go to the regulations that they say. Oh, here, they did not cite 7345, that's about the passport. They didn't cite 7655 that says Social Security's for the possession. They didn't cite Section 7651 4A that says Chapters 2 and 21 come from Section 3811 of the 1939 Tax Code. They can't even talk about the arguments. Everything they do is based on the presumption that everything you received was gross income. And they go from there. And they ignore the definition of citizen in those chapters. Now, what regulations did they not mention? They cited 1.83-3G once, but didn't get into its language, which says your cost is any money, the value of any money or property paid. They didn't cite 1.83-4B2, 1.1001-1A, gain or loss, 1.1011-1A, the 1012 adjusted basis is also known as adjusted basis. And they didn't cite 1.1012-1A that says your cost is cash or other property. They didn't cite 1.1402B-1D, which implements the definition of the term citizen, and it says a non-resident alien to this chapter will never owe this tax, but he might owe income tax on the compensation. The only other chapter for the self-employed is Chapter 1. So you got a Chapter 2 provision saying non-resident alien will never owe this tax, but he might owe Chapter 1. You can't be both citizens. They can't get into any of the regulations I use. And they just go to 1.6012, which is requirement to file because you had gross income. And they call this a work product. Look at this. The Commissioner respectfully advises this court that no oral argument is necessary. Oh, the court needs to hear it from you, as this appeal is frivolous. But we can't talk about it. We just can't talk about the law. But this is frivolous. Frivolous why? Because we say so. We own the court. We're the tax man. 30-year anniversary, folks. A long time I've been watching the government run from these specific provisions, which contain obvious truths. Now, listen, appellant indeed received non-employee compensation, but Section 83 has to make it gross income, and only then does one have to file a tax return, and only if gross income amounts equal or exceed the exemption amount, right? And listen to what they say. I'm going to keep this smaller. Taxpayer received non-employee compensation in these 2 years and did not file a tax return or pay income tax for either year. They don't get into the law that will make it so, and we're on page 3 of their memorandum, statement of the case. And so he should be penalized, and he should be made to file tax returns, and we can impose interest, and this is the amount of money he owes, all based on a presumption that 61A, everything is gross income. Let's see. Failed to file returns, pay income tax for those years. Taxpayer did not disagree. No, he didn't disagree with any of the facts. Of course he earned compensation. It's not gross income. Well, we can't talk about that. And they actually argued that the facts should decide the case because he hasn't challenged the facts. I heard from an attorney local here in Seattle. When you got the law on your side, you pound on the law. When you got the facts on your side, you pound on the facts. When you don't have either of those on your side, you pound on the table. And they say the facts of the case are clear. Yeah, we'll get to the law. No, we can't. It's only been 25 years. You have to wait 50 years. Or whatever. He had non-employee compensation of so much money from this year and so much money from that year. And so the IRS also imposed penalties based on taxpayers' failure to file required returns or pay income tax. Required returns? How does Section 83 operate? Well, we can't, Your Honor, impose penalties for the interruption by the taxpayer. That's how it works. And based on his failure to make estimated payments of self-employment tax. Well, he doesn't owe Chapter 2 tax. He's not that citizen. And how does Section 83 operate in your conclusion? Well, you can't have it. We're on page 5, Proceedings in Tax Court. Big deal. He reserved all his issues for appeal. And tax court never said, no, we won't penalize you. So, yeah, game on. They will penalize you. So only facts determine the outcome? Really? He used the law to rebut. And this piece of crap can't refute it and argues that facts alone are relevant. Statutory arguments are tax protester arguments. That's what comes from this paragraph. The tax court correctly sustained commissioners' determinations of taxes in addition to the tax. Those determinations are presumptively correct, and taxpayer bears the burden to demonstrate any error. Portillo versus Commissioner, 1995, I think, 1992. The presumption of correctness enjoyed by the commissioner disappears upon introduction of evidence to the contrary. A determination is a consideration of all relevant facts and statutes. And there's a bunch of cases in one annotation from the appellate level that say exactly that. A determination is a consideration of all relevant facts and statutes. That means they have to have considered the law and they won't talk about it. The determinations are presumptively correct. Well, I introduced evidence to the contrary. I've been deprived of Section 83, 212,111, and 12. They can't talk. Taxpayer did not dispute that he received non-employee compensation, failed to file tax returns, and made no payment. So what if it's compensation? It has to be gross income. That's what the tax code calls it. And we saw that the IRS says Section 83 provides for that determination. Instead, he sought only to advance numerous tax protester arguments, cut and pasted from the internet that the court correctly recognized as frivolous. But we can't talk about those statutes. And they're talking about my website, wevgov.com, and it wasn't copy or pasted. It's the fact it's spread out over the entire tax code and regs. And it's because of the fact the government has run 10 different directions from these same briefings in different actions. So I have to seal off all of the escape routes in a brief. Oh, it's cobbled together. It seems to be cut and pasted from the internet. No, it's right from the author of the treatise from 1994, the one that's prevented indictments and shut down criminal investigations. Because he disputed none of the facts on which the commissioner's determinations were based, taxpayers failed to rebut the presumption of correctness accorded those determinations. I've been deprived of Section 83. Well, the facts are on our side. The law means nothing. You just heard it. Replay this segment of the video if you missed it. The law has nothing to do with it. The facts add up to a liability, and we don't have to answer to the law. Why? Because you're in an American court. The tax man owns the court. You're looking at proof. Taxpayer now seeks to present for the first time before this court new issues on appeal that taxpayer himself alleges would have exposed him to sanctions in tax court. Well, you just called them frivolous tax protester arguments. And so they're illegal. These arguments are not properly before this court and, at all events, lack merit, but we can't talk about the provisions he relies upon. Wouldn't that mean that tax court can decide which issues are legal and which ones are not, imposing enormous monetary sanctions as a sort of fee imposed there for the privilege of appealing the issue that it won't hear? The argument's illegal in tax court. Since appellant didn't break the law and incur the penalties in tax court, he's waived rights to review the issue. That's what the government has just told this court. He should have been penalized in tax court. He can't raise the issues now. And I got a whole vocabulary from previous occupations that I could whip out and throttle them with in open public, in a restaurant. I wouldn't be able to hold it. Throttle down. Anyway, page 9. We're going to get into the arguments now. 9 through 16 are a waste of time. This is funny. Section 1 of the Internal Revenue Code imposes a tax on the taxable income of all individuals like taxpayer are citizens or residents of the United States. And they don't cite Section 1 as proof of it. They cite the regulation because the statute doesn't mention a citizenship. And so they cite the regulation that we're attacking, saying it's the only place citizens of the U.S. are mentioned. You can't do that in a regulation. And they cite the regulation as the authority for Section 1. Oh, anyway, let's see. Did this moron just cite a regulation as an authority? Is that precisely what the challenge is? Yeah. Section 63. How come we're in 63 already? And 61. Where's Section 83? The IRS General Counsel says 83 provides for the determination of what's gross income. No, we're the government. We decide. It's that loose. 61A, even though their own chief counsel in the opening brief of this taxpayer cited that revenue ruling, 2007-19. Here they are without it. So their own general counsel has nothing to do with this. 63 defines taxable income as gross income minus deductions. 61A, in turn, defines gross income except as otherwise provided as all income from whatever source derived, compensation for services. The Supreme Court has recognized that Congress intended 61A and its statutory precursors to exert the full measure of the taxing power. See this 1940 case. 61A is in the 1954 tax code. What are you doing telling the court that a 1940 authority reflects on 61A? The full measure of its taxing power. We aren't challenging Congress's taxing power. And to bring within the definition of income any accession to wealth. Well, if we were to do that, then damages. I was in a car accident. It was their fault. I broke my leg and I got compensated. That's not gross income. It's an accession to wealth. Right? What else is a loan? That's not gross income. Never makes it into gross income. And so this is horse shit. Taxpayers are required to file tax returns and keep records according to the requirements if they have gross income that equals or exceeds the exemption amount, and they finally admit it. Returns with respect to income tax shall be made, every individual having for the taxable year gross income which equals or exceeds the exemption amount. Yeah, and I made hay with that in the rebuttal to this reply brief. The term exemption amount, I want to talk about the term amount paid. The value of any money or property paid. Well, we can't do that. We're so far into gross income here, you can't drag them out of it. Here's that annotation. The presumption of correctness enjoyed by the IRS disappears upon introduction of evidence to the contrary. A determination must be the result of a consideration of all relevant facts and statutes. And there's the annotation on it. There's the Portillo decision, 1991. Let's see. Included in this grant of authority to assess is the authority to determine tax deficiencies, which is a consideration of all relevant facts and statutes. Well, not those. We don't consider those statutes. The IRS's deficiency determination is presumed correct, and the taxpayer bears the burden of showing otherwise, and we're only going to rely on the facts of the case, Your Honor, because the law is too uncomfortable. What do you say? And the judge is going to go, right. And he's going to lose. You can pause and read this. It doesn't mean anything. Oh, I'm sorry. This is about the, let's see. Burden of production of the, if the taxpayer believes that because of reasonable cause, substantial authority, or a similar provision, it is inappropriate to impose the penalty. It is the taxpayer's responsibility to raise those issues. The legislative history of 7491 assigns the IRS the burden of production with respect to a taxpayer's liability for a penalty. The legislative history makes it clear that in any court proceeding, the Secretary must initially come forward with evidence that it is appropriate to apply a particular penalty to the taxpayer before the court can impose the penalty, and if the taxpayer believes that for a reasonable cause or by substantial authority or similar provision that it is inappropriate to impose the penalty, it is the taxpayer's responsibility. Didn't he kind of just do that? Reserved all those issues for appeal because tax court will penalize me. And now they're berating him like he didn't do that, like it doesn't exist. Tax court properly sustained the deficiencies and additions of the tax determined by the commissioner. Okay. As discussed, taxpayers' deficiencies were entitled to the presumption of correctness, and the evidence submitted by the commissioner met his burden. But they won't talk about the law. Taxpayer did not dispute the evidence or attempt to show that he acted with reasonable cause or met another exception to the additions to the tax. You liars! Taxpayer did not dispute, not the evidence, but the way it was depicted as gross income. Well, we can't hear that. This is evasion, and they believe the court is the place to come to do it, and they're correct. Taxpayer owes self-employment tax. This ought to be interesting. Let's talk about the definition of citizen and Section 83. Well, we can't. Remember, we read the table of authorities. They didn't even mention those statutes. And they cite a court case. This is where they cite 1402B, the definition of citizen, but for another reason. Self-employment income is defined as the net earnings from self-employment derived by an individual during any taxable year. Net earnings from self-employment is defined as gross income derived by an individual from a trade or business. And they cite a statute that says that. But net earnings from self-employment is defined as gross income. Skip right over that because the self-employment tax provisions are broadly construed to favor treatment of income as earnings from self-employment. Wrong. It's to treat earnings from self-employment as income. Very important. Either the wheels are real loose on this person's understanding, or the way to speak of tax law has been twisted for so long in the government's favor they know what to say. The treatment of income as earnings from self-employment. No. The earnings from self-employment have to be treated as income. How did Section 83 operate? They can't talk. And what they just did, they skipped over a Chapter 2 regulation that says to figure this cost, you apply Chapter 1 provisions. That would include Section 83, wouldn't it? So by law, Section 83 governs taxation in Chapter 2. Here in the tax years at issue, the taxpayer performs services for payments of non-employee compensation. Taxpayer does not dispute that he received the payments, nor does he challenge their characterization as self-employment income. Wrong. That's Chapter 2. He's not that citizen, and Section 83. So he's lying to the court. He did not dispute that he received payment, nor does he challenge their character. he's got a brief on it. We read it. Man, it pisses me off so bad every time I read this. A government's reply. Taxpayer does not suggest otherwise, nor does he allege any error in the commissioner's computations. Stay away from my children. How do you say that after that briefing? They have to surgically remove this taxpayer's foot, and then they have the nerve to say he didn't even challenge it. Well, what's that big bandage on your ass? Nothing, Your Honor. Now back to the taxpayer. These record documents demonstrate, and taxpayer does not dispute, that taxpayer made no payments of a tax. Did he owe it? Can we talk about the law? Nor has taxpayer asserted any reasonable cause for his failure to pay a tax. But we can't talk about key provisions that apply. It's a recurring theme. It's the hole in law, or in due process. It's a constitutional crisis. The taxman owns the courts. He owes a penalty for failure to make payments of estimated tax. But we can't prove it's a tax. Taxpayer has waived his arguments that he reserved for appeal. In the tax court, taxpayer offered no rebuttal to the commissioner's determinations that he had received unreported non-employee compensation or that he owed taxes or penalties as a result. Instead, he offered only arguments as to why he should not be taxed. No, arguments as to why he doesn't owe what you call taxes. They got to be quoting tax court there. He did not submit those arguments for decision, however, instead characterizing them in his petition as reservation of claims for appeal. In his summary judgment briefing, taxpayer doubled down on this litigation strategy, insisting that he would never ask the tax court to look at the law. He's not stupid. And that the issues he had preserved for appeal were not being presented in the petition for review in tax court. Correct. And he is not stupid. Taxpayer's brief on appeal reiterates that he seeks review of issues not raised below due to the lower court's record of imposing sanctions on those who advance tax protester arguments. No, he didn't say they were tax protester arguments. On those who advance these arguments. See, they're throwing shit right at the guy, right there again. He never said that. But because taxpayer refused to advance those arguments in tax court, he has waived the right to do so. Taxpayer contends that he may make arguments for the first time on appeal to this court if the issues that he raises are purely legal or involve fundamental errors and miscarriage of justice. But he does not and cannot point to any error or injustice. But they don't take the time to explain, oh, he's wrong. He can raise these issues in tax court. They double down. These are tax protester arguments. Well, that means they're illegal in tax court. And so if you don't get penalized, what do they do nowadays? $5,000, $20,000? I think they can go up to $25,000. You have to incur those penalties as the rite of passage to raise issues about Section 83 when they've had it for 25 years. F government. To the extent taxpayers' arguments on appeal are not waived, they are without merit. Now, about those frivolous arguments, they're finally going to get into it. This is their rebuttal of the arguments we saw briefed. Taxpayers' challenge to the deficiency determinations consist entirely of tax defier arguments. Right there. Everything you say about the tax code is a tax protester argument. They can't even answer. Taxpayer argues first that the U.S. citizens are not subject to self-employment tax or income tax. Why? 3 reasons. I'm not the citizen in Chapter 2. If I am the citizen in Chapter 1, I'm only named in a regulation. And how does Section 83 operate in your conclusion I owe either of these taxes? They can't talk. It's about the facts because the law hurts. If the law helped them, they'd cite the law. Second, he essentially argues wages are not income. Not essentially. He never said this. And I nailed him on it in the reply brief. saying he never said that. What he said is he's been deprived of Section 83, 212,111, and 12. They have to lump you in with all the tax protester BS argued by people that didn't do the work and can't read the law, and they stigmatize you with all that old case law. And the judge is going to go, I agree. Because every judge is as corrupt as the DOJ obviously believes them to be. Third, he contends that Section 1, imposing the income tax, is void for vagueness. No, the scheme, not Section 1, the scheme imposing the tax. When the law is a secret, it's void for vagueness. You can't tax me with secret law. Finally, he objects to the power to revoke and deny passports. These arguments are frivolous and patently lack merit. He meant to say these arguments are patently frivolous and lack merit. So I guess any typos you find in my work, we're dealing with an attorney that can't even talk. Taxpayer first contends that U.S. citizens are not subject to taxes on income. Wrong. They were named only in a regulation, and they're not subject to an income tax on cost. They can't come to the argument. He argues that he is exempt from self-employment taxes. No, he's not exempted from them. He's never within the scope of them. He doesn't need an exemption. It doesn't apply to him. If you try it, it's a crime. Because those taxes are imposed only on non-resident aliens. That's not what he said. They're imposed on that citizen in those chapters, and that's not him. And that he is exempt from the income tax in general because the term citizen does not appear in Section 1. He's not exempted. The statute never approached him. He doesn't need an exemption. Neither contention is correct. Neither contention was made in his brief. 1401, Chapter 2, imposes self-employment income tax on earnings. No, it imposes it on gross income. Section 83A. Statute may say that, but it's an income tax. Section 83 applies to all compensation for services, which would include 1402A, self-employment earnings. Okay? Similarly, Section 1A through D of the Code imposes a tax on every married individual, head of household, individual, head of household. I got 39 cases that say the section, the regulation 1.1-1 is the authority that says this is proof you owe the tax, not every individual or head of household or married individual. So now they have to go a different direction to get out of this argument. Taxpayer does not, and indeed cannot, deny that he is an individual subject to self-employment and other income taxes. He filed a brief, right? He filed a brief. He does not and cannot. He filed a brief that only does exactly this. This is one of the most desperate statements I've seen in a government brief. Taxpayer does not, and indeed cannot, deny. You can't even speak about the provisions he used to say, I don't owe this, I've never owed it, you're screwing me this way and that way. Stating that Section 1 of the Code imposes an income tax on the income of every individual who is a citizen or resident of the U.S. And they're citing this regulation. Treasury Regulation 1.1 enforces this point. Spare me, I'm challenging that as void. This court, too, has repeatedly made it clear that U.S. citizens are subject to the federal income tax. None of these cases argued my evidence. None of them. Irrelevant. They have to stay irrelevant. Taxpayer's second contention, based on Section 83, is a variation of the shop-worn tax defier argument that wages are not income. I've been deprived of Section 83. You're stealing. Oh, he's basing it on a statute this time. It's just as frivolous because the law doesn't count. This attorney is exactly right. It's just Congress backing up the wages are not income argument. We can ignore Congress. And here is the IRS's Office of Chief Counsel. 2007-19, Section 83 provides for the determination of the amount to be included in gross income. Section 83 provides rules. It's a law. Section 83 provides rules for the inclusion in income of real or personal property other than money, and they cite 1.83-3E that says this shall apply to property received including real or personal property other than money, something to that effect. Well, to say that it doesn't apply to money because of this phrase, you have to interpret 1.83-3E and its use of the terms include or including. You have to interpret includes or including as being a term that limits the definition. And that violates Tax Code Section 7701C, which says when used in a definition in this title, the terms include and including shall not be construed to exclude things normally within the term defined. So this regulation uses including, and here they're trying to exclude something from it. You can't do that. It uses the term includes. In a nutshell, no, in a statute. In a nutshell, taxpayer must include in gross income the fair market value of the property received. You have to include your pay in gross income minus the amount paid therefor in money or other property. What the hell did you just say? Do I include it in gross income or not? You include it in gross income minus the amount paid. No, you subtract the amount paid, then you put in gross income the remainder. See how they just got the Section 83 equation upside down with that sentence? Taxpayer's argument that he may deduct the value, that's what you do from gross income. What's your paycheck doing in gross income already? Everything's made on the presumption that it's gross income. That he may deduct the value of his labor from his compensation, leaving no net taxable income. Repeatedly has been rejected as frivolous by this and other courts. Would you please cite a case that had Section 83 in evidence? No, we can't get to the law. And they throw all this tax protester horseshit at you. Because other people's cases that argued other law that lost mean you lose too, even though the law protects you and it wasn't argued in those other cases. Your claims are wrong and your interpretation of the law is void because others who argued totally different issues or statutes were wrong first. That brings pride as an excellent work product to the author of this memorandum. And their children go to the schools where your children go. Third, taxpayer contends that it follows from his construction of 83 and the other statutes that Section 1 is void for vagueness. No, the scheme is void. A statutory scheme is unconstitutionally vague when it is so vague or indefinite that it really is not a rule or standard at all, or when a person of ordinary intelligence cannot understand what the scheme requires. You can't even deny what the scheme requires. You can't even talk about the scheme. And they're calling the guy a tax protester. As explained above, taxpayers' construction of Section 83 is frivolous, but we haven't talked about it. Any money or property paid, and all the case law about how any money or any property is all inclusive. It's frivolous, which negates his argument that the income tax is vague to any degree. Taxpayers' final argument about the passport is speculative. Before a passport can be so revoked, the IRS must certify the existence of a seriously delinquent tax debt, $50,000 or more, and send notice of the certification to the taxpayer. A taxpayer who receives this certification can challenge it in tax court or in a district court pursuant to 7345. Tax court, every argument is illegal in tax court. I can't go to tax court. But there is no evidence of any such certification in the record here. Nor does taxpayer contend that he otherwise has standing to challenge the statute that has not yet been applied to him. As soon as he loses this appeal, it's full-on lien and levy mode. He's already got the notices of intent to levy. They're taking him for tens of thousands of dollars, and these people, Kian Persero, Avetta, Julie, Andrew Weiner, and Richard E. Zuckerman, think this is the way it should go. Happy 30th anniversary. My blood pressure's through the roof. Screwing an American when they know they're wrong. They know they're stealing. And here's his opposition to that. Table of authorities. You got his docket number. Look it up on Pacer if you want to go get these documents. And they didn't mention these in their briefing either. 1939 tax code sections. Didn't mention this, this, and these are in the equation. This, or any of these. Can't have them. They're secret. And it's the button I keep pushing. I'm not going to stop. They can't talk about it. If the provisions I cite screwed you, they'd take them out and screw you with them. That's the way law works. You see how I operate when the law's on my side. Yeah, my foot's in it. You're going to need a surgeon. And now, look at this. Here's a regulation under Chapter 2 that tells you to compute Chapter 2 tax, you use Chapter 1 provisions. For the purposes of ascertaining his net earnings from self-employment are to be determined by reference to the provisions of law and regulations applicable with respect to the taxes imposed by Sections 1 and 3. It's something else. The law actually, in Chapter 2, taxes only income and not self-employment earnings, as appellee stated. And this amount is determined by applying Chapter 1 provisions, which recognize as gross income only the excess over the amount, if any, paid. The excess over the value of any money or property paid by the taxpayer. Only the amount which remains after the adjusted basis has been restored to the taxpayer. Quoting the law. So screw what you said about Chapter 2. And here's the entire playbook. Appellee argues that the taxpayer's issues have been waived by his having not raised them in tax court, but at the same time acquiesces that the arguments are illegal in tax court. Despite the intentional confrontational tone and the insolence dispensed by the taxpayer in his petition, tax court did nothing to clarify or contradict the allegations in the petitions that uncomfortable truths have been abolished by tax court, truths proven through the plain language of, and then he cites the provisions the government runs from. Right there on the record. And Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, I have a right to know what I need to do to comply with the tax laws. They are entitled to clear explanation of the laws. Wrong. Liar. Not wrong. He's a liar. And this opposition was filed Friday the 13th, April 2018. Section 6012. You only file tax returns if you have gross income over the exemption amount. How do I figure gross income? IRS General Counsel says apply Section 83. And if you do that, you'll be penalized thousands of dollars. Something else. You can pause this anytime you want to read. I'm replying. This is the reply that the government filed. Appellee's reply at page 20. And I'm describing the lies. This is the good one. Very plain one. It says, taxpayer does not and indeed cannot deny that he is an individual subject to Chapter 2 and Chapter 1. Mr. Orth does deny that these statutes allow the application of Chapter 2, 21, and 23 to him because those provisions expressly exclude, by definition of citizen, any citizen of the United States. So he's hammering right back on them for all the lies they told. And go ahead and pause this if you want. But I'm not going to read all through this. We saw how off-base their brief is. And the big takeaway from this is they think that's a work product, folks. And they might go to your church, if they go to a church. Their souls are toilets. But they just feel free to walk around society, and they laugh at you, they laugh at the law, and they steal you blind every day. Just like pros. There's the Rossello decision again. Where Congress includes particular language in one section of a statute but omits it in another in the same act, it's generally presumed that Congress acts intentionally and purposely in the inclusion or exclusion. The short answer is that Congress did not write the statute that way. We refrain from concluding that the differing language in the two subsections has the same meaning in each. We would not presume to ascribe this difference to a simple mistake in draftsmanship. We are just the courts. We're not going to add to the law. And then they made that decision on the health care bill that said state exchanges means federal and state exchanges. So there goes that. But I still cite it, even though it was trashed. Hundreds of cases were overturned by that health care decision. And if it helps you to cite that decision as the destruction of that maxim, do it. Pause if you want to read this. Now, I'm only named in regulation. Here's the decision from Seattle U.S. District Court, 2008, Chief Judge Robert S. Lasnik. Here's how he disposed of the argument. We just heard how the government did it on appeal in the Seventh Circuit. Wrong. This is the correct answer. I got it from a chief judge in Seattle. How come you didn't cite this case? How come this isn't your answer? Because it's not good enough. Pause if you want. So my job in this reply pleading is to club the government again and get them back in line with what the guy actually claimed in his brief. Very easy. I think this statute's been violated. It protects me. Well, we can't talk about it. Okay. It's something else. And now I'm getting to the passport, so we're near the end of this because it went page by page through that government reply. Pause if you like. So there you have it on my 30th anniversary. The government is just a greasy pack of deviates and molesters. We just proved it again. And we've proven after 30 years we can move on and say, okay, they know they're stealing. We know they're stealing. They can't even talk about certain provisions. These provisions they didn't even mention. They did mention Section 1. Sorry, that shouldn't be in there. But anyway, didn't mention these provisions. How come? Well, we just can't talk about it. And so we now know they're stealing. Okay, we can accept that. And that the government views the court, every court, as the place to come to steal your money. Not for justice, not for the law. The court's purpose in our society is to make sure you lose to the government. This paragraph, so these things are true. Quality service, yeah, it's required here in quality service. Where are you? Here we go. B, in section 7803A of the IRS, or the Internal Revenue Code. Right to quality service. But we can't talk about the laws that explain how to tax you, even though we promised in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Oh, I think I understand. This is the situation. Go ahead and pause and read that. It's a disgrace. An unfavorable decision requires that this court ignore the government's 5 victories in the Supreme Court regarding the terms any in any property, and rule that the executive can, for any reason it can contrive, identify an item the law classifies as an amount paid or a cost, and simply mandate that said item is by such executive fiat now profit or gross income. That's the imposition of an income tax by the executive in violation of the 16th Amendment, which authorizes only Congress to lay and collect an income tax. Appellee never comes to approach this challenge from the taxpayer. Did I say that was I polite? Okay, previous there, go ahead. That's the last of the conclusion. Pause and read it. Certain provisions. Yeah, very certain provisions. And we can't talk about it. So 30 years, and what do we have? Okay, they're stealing. They're doing it in very particular ways they can't even deny. Very particular provisions they can't even talk about. While they throw obvious lies, diatribe, libel, it's sickening. And that says the DOJ believes every court, every judge is as corrupt as the day is long. He's going to lose because the DOJ is correct. And after 25 years of facing these challenges, that brief is the best they can do. It's closer to the arguments than they've ever come in any brief prior to this, and they still can't come close. Because the law is perfect. It works in exactly these ways. Citizens of the U.S. are only named in a regulation. On wevgov.com, federal income taxation page, I think it's 39 cases that point toward that regulation as the authority, 1.1-1. They don't point toward the term individual or married individual or head of household like they do in this brief. The government can't handle these issues as briefed. They go different directions from them depending on what court you're in, and the judges always agree. And they never get to the language of the provisions relied upon. So we can move on from, okay, show me the law. That's the anti-tax movement. I know the law. I know exactly what to argue, and I know you're stealing by screwing with the law this way, and that's extortion and racketeering. I filed a criminal complaint with 80 members of Congress January 1st of 2006. Cost me almost $6,000, 180 pages to 80 members of Congress. No response to that criminal complaint. Contains a briefing, just like you just read. So they know about it. Everybody knows about it. It's been injected into a bunch of civil and criminal cases. No one will talk about it. So we can move on with this positive. We have learned now and can freely, openly say to anyone we meet, America has no courts. Every judge is as corrupt as the day is long, according to the Department of Justice that wrote this piece of crap against this taxpayer to take him for tens of thousands of dollars that they can't even prove he owes. And he's going to lose because the Department of Justice is correct. 30 years. That's the best you can get out of America. I have pounded on this and pounded on this, and the government does that to a guy that can't even, arguing against the tax that says if it's not clear language, you got to put your finger on the law or you lose. You're the government. Even that case law isn't good enough for them. So the law and due process just pisses these people off. They take an oath of office to get their paycheck and contradict their oath of office with every pen stroke. And it's a disgrace. You have no courts, and we've just proven it. Happy 30th anniversary, Dave. Hey, thanks. Your work means so much. Anyway, folks, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Codebreaker. I hope you've learned things from it. That I jump into a document like that written by the government, but I have the backing of what I put in the opening brief. It simply throttles them. And I'm able to go into one of their documents, just clean their clocks. It's what I do. And you won't find anybody else out there, especially with their own treatise, responsibly applying the law to fact and going directly up to government and just hammering on them like this. And to come out with proof that, yeah, there are certain provisions they can't talk about. After 25 years, don't you think it's worth now picking up my materials, learning a couple of these arguments and letting them sink in? You can tell they're right at the tip of my tongue, top of my head. Bingo. And it causes them fits. One thing that won't happen after this, he's not going to be indicted. He won't be indicted. I got a court order out of Kentucky, U.S. District Court, a couple weeks ago, where the judge says right in the court order, the defendant doesn't believe he owes federal income taxes in this civil case that the Department of Justice brought against him. I might have mentioned it in one of the other videos. Now, so he's got a court order in a civil case saying he's innocent of tax evasion. Because if you don't believe you owe a duty, you're innocent. And here's a court order saying he doesn't believe he has a duty. Great, thanks. Now about the law. Well, we can't talk about that. And they dismissed his counterclaim, which sued for clear explanation of these provisions. So, no, you can't sue for those. You can't have a clear explanations. We don't want to talk about it. You lose your real estate in Kentucky in that case, and the law doesn't mean anything. It'll never be a part of anything. The tax man owns every single judge. So anyway, Codebreaker, I'll see you on the next installment. It's been my pleasure.